This is a short film of our voyage from Manzanillo in Mexico to Hiva in the Marquesas Islands, French Polynesia, that we undertook in 2017 aboard Monkey Fist, our Jeanneau 43DS. As passages go, we expected this one to be relatively straightforward. The most significant aspect of the voyage, from a sailor's point of view, would be the isolation and the sheer distance itself. For us, the main ingredients for a successful voyage, other than good luck, would be the same as for all our other passages: to have favourable winds and to be able to get enough sleep. Our departure point in Mexico, Manzanillo, was not selected for any reason other than we had travelled as far south as we could before running out of time for the crossing, as well as it being a designated customs and immigration point of entry into and out of Mexico. The season for doing this passage is based around avoiding the hurricane season in the North Pacific Ocean. This means that some yachts make the voyage as early as January, and some late starters like us depart in late April. Too early departure can mean exposure to the cyclone season in the southern hemisphere. The North Pacific hurricane season officially starts on the 15th of May, and we preferred to be south of 5 degrees north before that date, which should mean that we would be clear of any threat of hurricanes. We left our departure until this late in the season for two reasons. We wanted to see as much of Mexico as we could before we left, and we wanted to arrive in Tahiti by early July so we could enjoy the music and sports festival known as the Hiva, which we enjoyed so much during our previous voyage to French Polynesia in 2013. Our starting point, Manzanillo, is situated at 19 degrees 3 minutes north and 104 degrees 18 minutes west, and Atuona on Hiva in the Marquesas Islands is located at 9 degrees 48 minutes south and 139 degrees west. The rum line, or as the crow flies distance, is 2,680 nautical miles, or 5,290 kilometres. For many sailors it will be the longest passage that they will undertake in their sailing careers, as it will be for us most likely. Up until now, the longest passage for us has been our voyage from New Zealand to Ravavai in the Austral Islands, a distance of 2,100 miles we undertook in 2013, so this voyage would be about 25% longer. We expected that this voyage would take us around 3 weeks, but realised that it could take up to a week or more longer. It all depended on the wind and whether Monkey Fist suffered any damage en route that might affect her ability to sail and therefore slow us down. Our voyage plan was that once we were out of the influence of the American continent, we would take advantage of the strong, steady and favourable winds from the east and the northeast that are the trade winds. We intended to use these for as long as possible before turning south and passing through the zone of calms, thunderstorms and adverse winds that is known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or, as sailors call it, the ITCZ. The location and width of the ITCZ and our activities changes constantly and frequently, so it's difficult to plan too far in advance where and how to tackle it. Generally speaking though, the ITCZ extends east to west, and during the northern winter it is between 5 and 10 degrees north of the equator, which is shown here by the green dotted and dashed line. After negotiating the ITCZ, we hope to yet again enter another belt of trade winds on the south side of the equator and ride these all the way to Hiva. This photo is an infrared satellite image transmitted from a weatherfax station in Hawaii showing the cloud bands over the Pacific Ocean. We can receive these images at sea via our HF radio using a program on our laptop. In years past, if you wanted to receive this type of information, you would need a large, power-guzzling paper recording and expensive machine, but these days all you need is a HF or shortwave radio and a laptop. The location of the cloud bands generally indicates storm activity, and so, for where we were headed, it would help us locate and minimise our exposure to the ITCZ, keeping to the north of it until we found a gap, or at least a slot, where it was thinnest, and therefore reducing the possibility of having to deal with the less than favourable conditions that accompany it. Another piece of information that should help us to locate and avoid the worst of the ITCZ is the streamlined analysis chart that is also available by weatherfax from Hawaii. The charts feature lines that show the general direction of the wind, but for us, the most useful feature is that it shows where the ITCZ is, or at least where the meteorologists who prepare them believe it to be. The ITCZ is not always continuous either, and may be made up of more than one band of activity. You can see here that it's split into two sections. The round mark onto the right of the screen shows where our destination Hiva in the Marquesas is located. This picture is a screenshot of a grid file or gridded information binary data that is probably the main source of weather information for the modern sailor once offshore. It can be obtained at sea via email if you have a satellite phone or, as in our case, a HF radio and a modem. This type of forecast is computer generated, but we've found over the years that they're pretty reliable for direction and general trends in strength changes. Their most important use is to help sailors avoid strong or intense weather systems, but hopefully on this voyage this is something we don't expect to have to deal with, but one never knows, especially now and with how we're changing the climate, so out of seas and tropical storms are becoming more of a possibility. Each of the black arrows indicates the direction of the wind, while the shorter black line or barb at the back end of the arrow indicates the strength. A long barb represents 10 knots and a short one 5, so you can see two long barbs on the arrows to the west indicating 20 knots. You can also see here the wind is coming from the north and the northeast and the northwest. The colours are also a general indication of strength, and here they show the stronger winds in the yellow to the west and the lighter winds in the blue to the south of our departure point. One of the issues when leaving from the mainland of Mexico is the general lack of wind within a few hundred miles of the coast. Almost exclusively the wind in this part of the world at this time of year comes from the northern sector, so we don't expect that the direction of the wind will be an issue for us, only the strength and most likely this year the lack of it. Looking at the forecast for around our intended departure window, we could see no benefit in sitting around waiting for stronger wind, as we couldn't see any improvement coming in the near future. A couple of days beforehand we decided that the 16th of April held a small advantage with at least a little wind near the coast, so that was when we decided to leave. The forecast wind showed an area of slightly higher wind, 10 knots or so if we stayed to the north of our rum line. We planned to maintain a fairly northerly course for a start, which would help us avoid the weaker winds to the south and also would decrease the angle we were sailing to the wind and thereby consequently increase the apparent wind on the sails. In lighter winds, this can mean the difference between moving at a reasonable speed or barely drifting. We were prepared for a slow start to the trip, but hopefully things would improve as we went along. We cleared out with the Mexican authorities and, as luck would have it, the wind was slightly stronger than predicted and we found ourselves moving along between 5 and 6 knots with smooth seas and clear skies under full main and Jeanneau. You can see that even though there aren't any white caps on the waves, we're still moving along very nicely indeed. We knew that the wind wasn't going to last, so we were making the best of what we had and so started to settle down into our pattern of sharing the watchkeeping duties around the clock. What a fantastic start to the trip. About 100 miles from the coast of Mexico, we were joined by the first of our new crew members, a ringed turtle dove Francis named Splash. Splash preferred the comfort of our cockpit rather than being out on the exposed deck. He or she ended up keeping us company for the next couple of weeks, and when Splash later left, we really did miss him. Later that same day, we were joined by more hitchhikers, this time in the form of boobies, whose preferred roost was on the bowsprit. I've little doubt that landing on boats is a learned behaviour, and it's the first time we've had the birds land on this particular part of Monkey Fist. On our passage from Tuvalu to Kiribati in 2014, we had boobies land on the top of the mast, which we unsuccessfully tried to discourage. That was the only occasion we've had boobies do this, and no amount of banging, shouting, horn blowing or changes in course would dissuade them from achieving their goal. The most birds we counted on the bowsprit at any one time was 11, made up of at least 2 different species. Some birds were adult and some juvenile. You can see that the birds, regardless of species, always face into the wind, most likely because doing otherwise would result in having ruffled feathers. It was impressive to see how they managed to balance on the thin wire supporting the bowsprit. As Monkey Fist rolled back and forth, they would roll in the opposite direction, always displaying impeccable balance. For humans, it's difficult to believe how this would be such an unconscious action that you would be able to sleep, but that's exactly what these birds did. They tucked their head under their wing and rolled back and forth while the boat rolled in the opposite direction. The birds would come into roost in the afternoon, and we believed logically that they would stay there for the night and take off in the early morning to once again soar over the waves hunting for fish. But we were wrong. As the first dawn broke and the morning passed, the birds quite happily remained as our guests most of that day and into the following night. So, that's something else we don't understand. Presumably, due to their lack of contact with humans, they showed no fear of us whatsoever. We were able to approach them closely before they showed any signs of being uncomfortable. Another first for us with the behaviour of boobies was seeing them hunting airborne flying fish. However, we didn't see any catch of fish. Every sailor's favourite watch would have to be when the first hint of a new day shows itself in the sky, regardless of weather. But when you have excellent wind and fine weather, I think it's one of the real pleasures of life, and it's often incredibly beautiful and serene. We continue to experience winds stronger than forecast, and for the first 3 days we made better than expected time, logging 390 miles. As the wind began to die out, we were able to continue our good progress by using our Code Zero. This is a large, light headsail, the same size as our old spinnaker but with a flatter cut, which meant that we were able to fly at a closer angle to the wind. You can see here from the sea state that by now we had very little wind, but the sails were still full and we were still moving, so we continued to sail for as long as we could. The latest grid weather information showed that we were on the northern edge of an area of calm to the south, and we decided that the best option for us was to turn south, motor through it and find the wind on the other side. To our pleasant surprise, by 6 o'clock the following morning, a 12 to 15 knot breeze had built up from the northeast, and we were soon sailing again with our sails in a goose-winged configuration. By noon the following day, the wind had again faded, so we were forced to turn on the motor and again turn to the south in search of wind. During the afternoon, Frances was sitting on deck gazing around when a huge shape slid past Monkey Fist heading in the opposite direction. It was a huge whale shark, and it happened so quickly that she didn't even have time to snap a photo. A slight breeze found us again early the next morning, and we turned to the west-southwest under goose-wing sails. Our speed was only 3.5 knots, but we were sailing. Later that day we turned more to the west, and still later the wind picked up to just under 20 knots, which meant that we were on a broad reach under full main and Jeanneau, with again no swell, so just about perfect sailor conditions. The wind continued to build and was by now gusting to well over 30 knots. After reducing both main and Jeanneau, we were still sailing along comfortably at 7 knots. The scattered fair weather cumulus clouds eventually turned the sky overcast, and we experienced a couple of mild squalls. The infrared satellite weather facts we downloaded showed that we were entering what appeared to be a northerly bulge in the ITCZ, and rather than go round it, we kept our course, hoping the wind would hold, which it did very nicely. It was rainy and squally, gusting over 30 knots, but we still had wind, and that's all that mattered. It was about this time that we started to experience an intermittent issue with our autopilot. The malfunctions became more and more frequent, and the following evening our worst fears came true. We were mortified. We'd covered a little over 1,200 miles and still had 1,500 miles to go. It meant that we would have to steer 750 miles each, which would be about 150 hours each at the helm. The lounging around in the cockpit, reading, playing guitar, listening to tapes, watching movies, making tea or snacks had all gone up in smoke. Our whole situation had changed in an instant. Modern design yachts like Monkey Fist, with a fin keel and balanced spade rudder, are very hard to steer by hand because there's no feedback through the wheel, so what you tend to do is to overcorrect. During the daytime you can use the sky and the sea for reference, and it is somewhat easier. At night, however, if there are no stars or moon, then all you have is the small red glow of the compass light to guide your response, and it is a very challenging task. This is a screenshot taken from our below decks navigation computer, which shows the track of Monkey Fist while the autopilot was steering. And this is a screenshot of the track of Monkey Fist while we were hand steering. You'd have to agree that the difference is remarkable. One has to be impressed by the equipment's ability to steer straight. We took 3-hour watches during the night rather than our usual 4, and we managed to survive. However, by daylight my incentive level had increased significantly, and I confirmed that the issue was indeed with the drive arm, so while Frances soldiered on at the helm with her fingers crossed, I removed the drive arm. I then dismantled the machine on the saloon table and within an hour had found the problem, reassembled and refitted the arm. We pressed the auto button and voila, it worked. We punched through the band of clouds back out into the fine weather, under a sky speckled with scattered fine weather cumulus clouds, and we continued on our course again under a goosed wing rig. One of the challenges of being at sea is the preparation of food. We often pre-prepare and freeze our dinners, but other meals we prepare according to the conditions. If the weather is okay, sometimes we lash out and have bacon and eggs. It's an art to make sure that nothing goes flying or is spilt, often having to time your actions with the movement of the boat. When at sea, always appreciate your food, especially when it's bacon and eggs for breakfast. Our cockpit is very comfortable and it's always a great view, and I have difficulty remembering the last occasion that we ate down below. Splash was getting more used to our presence and would quite happily sit within a metre of us, but he did have his limits. He had developed this move where he would raise his wings if we were getting too close to him. I guess he was saying, "I'll fly away if you get any closer, I will." On day 10, we finally reached the halfway mark.
How far have we got to go?
1,457 nautical miles.
Our original plan had been to continue westward for another few days, but the latest streamline analysis charts made us question if there was any value in doing so. Some of the latest charts had even shown that the ITCZ had completely dissipated, so we decided to turn our bow to the south, take the plunge and follow the rum line to the Marquesas. It would still take us 2 days sailing to reach the position of where the ITCZ had last formed, and yet again we crossed our fingers. The wind held very nicely for the next 2 days, and we were still averaging around the 6-knot mark under mainly clear skies and again almost perfect sailing conditions. On our 12th day of the voyage, we entered the ITCZ. There were storms all around, and we were down to a deeply reefed main and staysail, with torrents of rain washing over us. We had enough time for a quick shower on deck, and the storm was gone. Shortly afterwards, the wind died completely, and we were again under motor, this time with lumpy seas. And the big question was, what was in store for us? But whatever happened, we would have to deal with it because out here there's no other choice. Later that day, a glance at the sky showed the cloud was breaking up, and a tickle behind my ear was an indication that, to our immense pleasure, a breeze had sprung up yet again from the northeast. We figured it wouldn't last, but we would use it while we could, so after 6 hours of motoring, we had all sail up and we were again in our quiet and peaceful gurgling wheel, churning along at just under 6 knots. You can see Francis here cleaning off the unfortunate squid and flying fish that landed on the deck during the night. I've heard of some hardy sailors frying them up for breakfast, an admirable use of fish protein, but that was not going to happen on Monkey Fist. flying fish rate very lowly indeed on our list of edible seafood. Now we figured that Splash was coming all the way to French Polynesia with us, and my goal, before we arrived, was to have him perch on my finger. I was getting closer, but as you can see, I still had some work to do before I could henceforth be known as the Bird Whisperer. We continued to sail south with daily runs between 140 and 150 miles under clear skies and smooth seas. Looking far to the north, we could see large banks of clouds, and at night we could see lightning, but our skies were clear and our wind was fair. When we later checked our weather information, it indeed showed us that the ITCZ had reformed to our north, but also well south of its previous latitude, and because we had been making such good progress, we'd left it far behind. We had built a perch for Splash in the cockpit, which he generally roosted on only at night, at which time either of us could do whatever we wanted near him and he wouldn't move. He was also beginning to preen his feathers more and more frequently, which, at that time, we didn't really place much significance on. We settled into our routine, and each day became much like each one before, and with constant wind, fine weather and smooth seas, we couldn't have asked for anything more. This is a screenshot of the grip files that we downloaded showing the track of Monkey Fist in black. By now, we had started to experience the beginnings of the southeasterly trade winds. However, the grip files were not promising a great deal of wind. In fact, very little indeed. But this is one of the advantages of having a modern boat using our large headsail, the Code Zero. As the wind veered more towards the southeast, our speed increased, often reaching up to 8 knots. We still had 1,000 miles to go, but at this rate we'd be there before we knew it. The flat cut of the Code Zero meant that we could fly it with an apparent wind well forward of a beam, and we continued to glide our way to the south-southwest, day in, day out. This is a little difficult to see, but it's a shot of Monkey Fist's chart plotter, and in the small box in the middle is our speed, over 7 knots. Not an uncommon speed for us, but with such little wind, I was impressed. One evening, Frances walked up the companionway to start her watch and asked me where Splash was. We looked around and realised that he'd flown the coop. We were 1,500 miles from land, and he had been with us for a little under 2 weeks. Which direction he went we'll never know. Mexico, Hawaii, the Marquesas. We recalled that he'd been spending an inordinate amount of time over the last few days preening his feathers, which we realised was in preparation for his long flight. Good luck, Splash. The latest grid showed that the wind would be more or less on the beam, an ideal angle for us, sometimes up to 15 knots, but often as little as 5. Still, we made our own wind and we ticked off the miles. We had our best day's run during this time, clocking a little under 160 miles. Within 100 miles of our destination, the wind backed to the northeast and faded. This meant goose-winging again, but we tried a new approach by raising the Code Zero as well as the mainsail and the Jeanneau, all the sail we could muster. The wind had to be at exactly the right angle, and so it was. There was enough wind to keep all the sails full, and we were managing to do between 5 and 6 knots. In the evening twilight of the 6th of May, we could make out the silhouette of Hiva just under 50 miles to the south-southwest. At 4 o'clock the next morning, and only 3 hours out of Atuona, the wind finally gave up the ghost and we started the motor. At dawn on the 7th of May, after 21 days at sea, we were abeam the cloud-topped eastern tip of Hiva. What a magnificent sight it was. The Marquesas are arguably the most beautiful archipelago in the world. and having such a landfall after 3 weeks just made it all the more special. A quick word on fishing. We had fished all the way, but had not managed to land anything edible. In the end, we lost 4 lures and a rod and reel, which we'll have to put down to experience. However, just as we made landfall, we finally landed some edible fish, 2 magnificent big-eye tuna. 2 hours later, we dropped the anchor inside the harbour at Atuona. It was a surprise to see so many yachts still there. Most of the boats from the west coast of the US and Mexico had moved on, but we hadn't taken into account the boats sailing from Panama and the Galapagos Islands. Altogether, there were almost 40 anchored in and outside the harbour. So in the end, it had taken us 21 days and we had travelled 2,827 nautical miles, 200 miles further than the Rumline distance, and this averaged out at 135 miles per day at a speed of 5.6 knots. Not the fastest passage, but not so shoddy either. Adding up all the times that we were under motor, it was less than 24 hours the entire voyage, which was very pleasing. Even taking into account the issue with the autopilot, we would have to say that this would have to have been one of the easiest and most comfortable passages that we've undertaken. The seas were not overly rough, the wind remained strong enough to sail almost all the way, and we had managed to essentially avoid the ITCZ. I don't think that we could have asked for better weather. I can't say how often the weather is like this, but I do know that it's not always this good. I've read reports from people who have had an absolutely miserable time encountering bad weather. We know of one boat who did this in 18 days, but they had strong wind, rainstorms and squalls the entire way. Whilst editing this film, we heard of another boat that was motoring into Hiva without a rudder. We also know of at least 2 boats earlier this season that came from the west coast of America and had to motor for a number of days due to their lack of wind. So the bottom line really is that we were lucky, but we did make the most of that luck. And when it's all said and done, we had a fantastic voyage. We've made this film mainly for 2 reasons. Hopefully it will be helpful for those planning to undertake the passage in the future, and also to share this with people who might like a glimpse of our lives at sea. Hope you enjoyed it.